9 statements of Jesus, and they're important because from those statements we learn who Jesus is. It was Jesus saying, I know who I am. He didn't have an identity crisis. He wasn't confused. He knew very clearly who he was and why he came to earth. And so those statements mean a lot to us. And so today we're looking at another one of those statements where Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. Now, I told you earlier that I was in ROTC for a little while in college to escape being in PE class. Also, my freshman year in college, first semester, somehow, I'm not quite sure how it took place, but there was a bet and I accepted it, and the challenge was for me not to eat for 7 days. And I said, sure, I'll do that. And so I remember I went to church Sunday. On the way home from church, we stopped at Wendy's. The first time ever, I've never done it before, never did it since, I got the triple. You know, I realized what was in store, you know, no food, so I got the triple cheeseburger. And I packed it all in there, and from Sunday afternoon until the next Sunday afternoon, I had nothing but water. And I remember even going to the cafeteria and sitting with my friends and just sipping on water as they ate cafeteria food. But let me tell you, I wasn't missing much, you know. It was college cafeteria food. I remember Wednesday night was the worst. It seemed like my stomach was gnawing and everything that was inside there. It was saying, if you're not going to feed me, I'm going to find something in here to eat on my own. And it was terrible. I've never experienced hunger like that. Now, once I got past Wednesday, wasn't too bad. But Wednesday was terrible. And I share this because, you know, a lot of times we say, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. And the reality is, you know, it's been 3 hours since we last ate. I think that Wednesday night I really experienced hunger, and I think most of the people in our world experience hunger at that level on a daily basis. They wake up hungry, they go to bed hungry. And Jesus is talking and saying, I can feed and satisfy you and take away that hunger. And so it's a strong statement that Jesus is making here. He's trying to let the people know that he can fulfill us in a way that no one else can. Well, I showed you the clip earlier. That's not the Jesus saying, I'm the bread of life statement. He's feeding the 5,000. And it's important for you to understand the feeding of the 5,000 because it's in that context that Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. So as we saw in the video, Jesus is teaching. And it says in John's account that there was 5,000 men, so it's not counting the women and the children. It could have been as many as 15,000 people gathered there. It gets late in the day, and it's very acute. Everyone's hungry. And so, you know, what are we going to do? How are we going to feed these people? They realize it's a problem. It's not like they can just run to Piggly Wiggly and pick up enough food. And even if Piggly Wiggly was nearby, you know, who's going to pay for it? And so it's an issue. So Andrew brings this boy, and he has a typical lunch, some bread and some fish. And we see Jesus multiply that, and it tells us in the account that not only was everyone there, all 15,000, completely full, but there was 12 baskets of leftovers in addition to that. And so what we see is what takes place is the next day is when we pick up in John chapter 6, and it tells us that some of the people, when they got up the next day, they said, where did Jesus go? And they looked for him, and they found him in Capernaum. And when they found him in Capernaum, they had this conversation with him in John chapter 6. So let's look at John 6. We're going to look at verses 30 through 35. So they asked him, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it was my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And let's skip down in the chapter to verses 47 through 51. Very truly I tell you, the one who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, and which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Now, there's some misconceptions that the people that Jesus is talking to are having. They're not quite relating and connecting to what Jesus is trying to tell them. And sometimes you and I have that same kind of problem. We don't really understand what it's all about. So let me unpack some of these misconceptions that they're having. First, they forgot that God is the source for all that is good in life. You notice that in that passage, they're giving credit to Moses. Moses gave us manna. And Moses gave us manna every single day. They're wanting Jesus to continue to provide bread for them. They're wanting food. You know, it's a pretty sweet deal. We'll follow Jesus around, and Happy Meals are going to be popping out, so we're content. We want another Happy Meal. And Jesus is saying, I'm not going to be here to give you that kind of bread. I don't want to give you the bread that fills you today, but you're hungry again tomorrow. I want to feed you this bread of life that's going to satisfy you forever. And so they're wanting Jesus to do one more miracle. But the big thing that Jesus says you're not understanding is Moses didn't do this. Yeah, the account's there that Moses was there, and Moses asked for the manna, and he asked for water, and he asked for there to be the doves that came on the ground. Moses did all the asking, but it was God who provided. You know, and I think in our day and time, we really have a big misconception, just like they did. We go to work, we get paychecks, and we go to the store, and we fill our cupboards with things, and we think we did that. You know, I worked, I made money, I went shopping, I put them in the grocery pantry, and I did that. But the reality is everything we have, everything, comes from God.
Amen.
And we need to have a grateful, thankful heart for what God has given us. And whenever we take the credit away from Him, we're placing it on ourselves or someone else falsely. Because God is the giver of all things. If God did not want us to have it, we wouldn't have it. The Lord giveth, and the Lord can take it away just as easily. And so we need to keep that in mind of where the source of things are in our life, and it's God Himself. The other thing that these people had a misconception about is that powerful miracles would satisfy their hunger. Powerful miracles would satisfy their hunger. They wanted to see one more miracle. They in fact said, if you show us another sign today, Jesus, we'll believe in whatever you're saying. We just want to see you do something. You know, there's something about seeing something like that and seeing a miracle, and instead of hearing what Jesus was talking about, they just wanted to see Him do something spectacular again. They wanted to see a show. And Jesus, as you watch throughout His ministry, Jesus never performed on request. You remember that even Herod said, you know, do something, Jesus. Let me see you do something. And Jesus wasn't a magician. He wasn't a performer. He wasn't an entertainer. There's only two ways that Jesus would perform a miracle. First, Jesus would perform a miracle out of compassion for a hurting person. How many times do we encounter in Scripture that we see His heart was heavy within him because he saw someone who was blind, or someone who was a leper, or someone who was lame, and his heart broke with compassion, and he reached out and he healed them, or touched them, or did something to make them whole again. The other reason that Jesus would perform a miracle is to teach them an important spiritual principle about either Jesus himself or about the kingdom of heaven. And those were the only two ways that Jesus would perform a miracle, is if there was some healing, compassionate act or some lesson that needed to be taught. The people here in our crowd are missing why Jesus is doing it. They just want Jesus to do another miracle. So why not? Why wouldn't Jesus just say, you know, you've come a long way. We were together yesterday. Let me just whip up a little something special for you. You know, what would be the harm? But Jesus knew that performing a second miracle would only lead to the need to perform a third miracle. That would only lead to having to perform a fourth miracle. And that miracles were not going to bring them. The real miracle that they needed was salvation. And so if he kept doing miracles, they would not be transformed in their life until they understood the lessons that Jesus was trying to teach to them. Miracles will never satisfy our hunger for God. The only thing that will is that personal relationship we have with the bread of life. And so they were certainly in need of a miracle of salvation. The third thing that they weren't understanding was they forgot that the essence of human life is spiritual and not physical. So many times we get focused on our physical needs, we forget about our spiritual needs. And so they were hungry and they wanted something to eat, and they felt like if they could just get enough food, they would be satisfied. But the reality is we're different. God made us unique and special. As you look at the creation process, God made everything. Rocks, plants, trees, animals, the birds in the air, the fish in the sea. He made everything. But when he came to making humans, he did something different. He breathed life into us. He put a soul into us. He created a need for us to have a relationship with God. Dogs don't have that. Cats don't have that. Cactuses don't have that. There's no God need in anything else other than us. You know, if an animal eats, an animal's happy. He doesn't lay down and say, I wish there was something more. He's content. But for us, we can eat and there's still a hunger in us. There's still something else that says, I'm not satisfied, I'm empty. And that's our need for God. You may recall when Satan was tempting Jesus, one of the ways he tempted him with food, remember Jesus didn't eat for 40 days, and so he took some rocks that looked like bread, and the devil said, why don't you just turn these rocks into a loaf of bread, Jesus? And remember what Jesus said in Matthew 4:4? Jesus said, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And what Jesus is saying is not a true statement just for Jesus, it's true for us as well. If we just feed our physical body, our spiritual self is starving. And we're really good at taking care of the physical self, aren't we? I mean, you can look at me. I haven't missed many meals. But if we are so good at feeding the physical, why can't we be that good feeding the spiritual? The inner man needs to be fed as well. You know, we talk about bread as being a staple. It's one of those things you have to have. It's one of those things, usually with every meal we have, there's some kind of a bread item on our plate. You know, it's funny when they say on the news that there's snow in the forecast, what happens at Kroger's? It's all gone. No bread. The only thing I can think of is we're having French toast in the morning. I mean, why else would you need milk and bread? But, you got to have it. It's a staple. I think maybe, I don't know, you could make anything in the kitchen as long as you have bread and milk. It's a staple for us. But if we think it's a staple for us today, it was really a staple in the time of Jesus. They didn't have a lot of food. And they had to work hard for the food they had. And sometimes a piece of bread was all they had. That was their meal. And so when Jesus is talking to this audience and saying, I am the bread of life, they're going, man, that's just awesome. That he could just give us the food that we need. Because they know how important it is to eat. There's a lot of times they would go to bed not having anything to eat. And so that's why they were following Jesus, wanting one more meal. But sometimes we do the same thing that they did. We assume we can find ways to feed our inner self in other ways, but we're mistaken. In Isaiah 55:2, it says, why spend money on what is not bread, and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me and eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest of fare. There's another misconception that they had, and I wrote it in the wrong language. So I said only Jesus can completely satisfy, which is a true statement, but if I'm saying it's a misconception, we need to flip it and say they assume Jesus cannot satisfy, but he can. Jesus can fill that inner need like no one or nothing else. I don't think there's anything more disappointing, at least for me, to leave the dinner table unhappy, unsatisfied, unfilled, or food that just didn't taste very good. It's like that was a waste. I remember one time Cheryl's mom invited us down for dinner. Literally, we went down the stairs and had dinner at her house, and she had bought one of those little daisy hams. The kind I'm talking about. And she had cut off 3 slices, and she served it, and we each got a slice. And when I say a slice, I'm talking this slice was so thin I could read the newspaper through it. And I looked, there was no other slices. She had a slice, Cheryl had a slice, I had a slice. And so I ate my slice. That was it. It's like there's got to be more. And I remember going upstairs thinking, I'm going to have cereal or something because that ham wasn't doing it. And the same thing is true so many times. We get these thin little slices and we think they're going to satisfy us, and they don't. Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, and I'm going to satisfy you. I'm going to fill those hunger cravings like no one else can. St. Augustine once prayed, Thou hast made for thyself, and our hearts are restless without thee. Only in Jesus do we find food for our souls. It's interesting what happens in chapter 6. I want you to see what Jesus is saying in verse 35. In verse 35, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Now in that statement, when he says I am, it's a double positive. It doesn't really show up in English very well, but he is saying, I am the only one who can stand on this statement. But not only is there a double positive in this sentence, there's also 2 double negatives. Again, poor English, but very strong in the Greek. When Jesus says never, it's not never. Jesus says you will not never go hungry. You will not never go thirsty. So he's saying really 2 things. He's saying, I'm the one that can provide, and you will never go hungry or thirsty again. They're very strong statements that he's making. Only Jesus is the bread of life. You know, if you look at all the offerings that the world provides, look at all the things that they could just put on a buffet table, and you've got your platter, and you can walk down there and take a scoop of whatever you want. You can take a scoop of everything the world has to offer and sit down, and you can just gorge yourself on whatever the world has, and you know what? You will still be hungry. It's kind of like eating Chinese. You know, you can eat a lot, and then 30 minutes later you find yourself hungry.
That's true.
But Jesus says that won't happen with me. You know, and you can look at any world religion. There's a lot of promises that world religions make. They say that you're going to find peace, you're going to find harmony, you're going to find nirvana, you're going to find enlightenment. There's no world religion that says you're going to be satisfied. Only Jesus makes that statement. I like what the psalmist says in Psalm 34:8. He says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Taste and see that the Lord's good. You know, there's a lot of new foods out there, a lot of foods prepared differently, and you could watch the Food Channel, and you can learn all about the food. You could read blogs about food and hear what the critics say about the food. You can talk to people who've had that food and say, what did you think when you ate that food? But you know, the only way to really experience a new food is to taste it, right? Taste and see. See if you like it. And I'm not talking about the taste and see like a 3-year-old does with broccoli, okay? Not that kind of taste. When you're 3 and you're trying broccoli, there's this kind of, well, I'm not going to like it, so you kind of lick it. You know, you don't really taste it. But I like broccoli. I'm glad my grandkids like broccoli. They tasted it, and they said it was good. You cannot try Christianity. You got to commit to Christianity. You got to jump in there and experience it. You got to taste and see that the Lord's good. Now, chapter 6 ends in an interesting place. Look at verses 60 and 61. It says, on hearing it, many of his disciples, and it's not talking about the 12 disciples, they were the followers, the people that were wanting these miracles, they said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, does this offend you? And then in verse 66 of chapter 6, it says this, from this time many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. It was too much. They weren't willing to pay the price. They weren't really going to taste and see. They weren't committed. And they left. It got too hard. The choice is ours today. You know, if you're not a Christian, you have never actually tasted. You've heard about it. You've watched the shows. You've heard all about the goodness of God. You've talked to people who said, I've tasted and I've liked it, but you've never tasted it for yourself. I would say today's the day to jump in there and feast on the Word of God. But you know, for the rest of us who are Christians, you know, I think we've got a problem. Here's what I think we're doing. I think we're kind of like kids that come home from school and we're eating all this junk food, and then when mom has dinner for us, we're not hungry. I think when we're feasting on all this junk the world has to offer, and we're not feasting on the bread of life, we're not eating the spiritual food, we're eating all this other stuff. And our inside spiritual self is crying out. It's famished. It's desiring to hear from God's word, and we're not feeding it because it's stuffed with all this other stuff. My recommendation is that we say, I want to have a hunger and a thirst for the righteousness of God that can only be filled and satisfied by God himself. And my encouragement is for you to make that commitment today, that I will have an appetite that I will only feed with God himself. It's already in there. God put that in there for you. And you would think as Christians we would know where the source of our nutrition comes from. But yeah, the world's kind of slick. And we find ourselves eating in places we shouldn't eat, feeding on things we shouldn't have in our mouth. And then when it comes time to eat on the Word of God, we're not hungry. I think that has to change if we're going to be the people of God who need to serve him like the people of God should. Would you stand as we sing?